America at War. In this video, we will examine the process of mobilization for war and the different American experiences during the war, both overseas and at home. Mobilization. After declaring war on Germany, the United States, under the leadership of President Wilson, faced many challenges. The United States was not ready for war, and soon had to start a process of mobilization, which meant assembling and training the troops and producing equipment and supplies for the war. Wilson hesitated between raising a voluntary army or relying on conscription. Under the Selective Service Act, more than 10 million men registered for conscription, or the draft, and were selected randomly according to their date of birth. Another 2 million men volunteered for service. Allied leaders hoped that American soldiers would fight in their army ranks, but instead, Wilson announced his intention to keep all the American troops together as the million-man American Expeditionary Force. Paying for the war. Another great challenge was paying for the war. President Wilson calculated that the new income tax and special taxes on war profits would be enough to pay for the war, but the costs turned out to be much greater than expected. The rest of the cost was financed through the sale of war bonds. Bonds are notes sold by the government. These notes pay a fixed interest and are bought back by the government after a certain period. Liberty bonds, which is what they called World War I bonds, paid low interests, but Americans bought them in great numbers out of a patriotic duty to support their country in this crucial war. The war cost a total of $30 billion, and public debt suddenly rose from $1 to $20 billion. Most of the money spent, however, went to loans for allies. As a result, the United States became a creditor nation, meaning that instead of owing money to foreign countries, these countries now owed money to the United States. The wartime economy. The economy had to be transformed in order to meet the demands of the war effort. The United States continued to help the Allies with supplies and loans, but also started preparing to train the newly recruited troops and producing weapons and equipment for military use. The federal government gained more power, and President Wilson began to regulate wartime production by creating new agencies. The Food Administration was created to oversee the production and distribution of food. As farmers were guaranteed a minimum price for their wheat, food production increased. Rather than resorting to rationing, the American public was asked to voluntarily eat less wheat and meat, and even grow their own vegetables in victory gardens, in their own backyards, or even public parks. All surpluses of food were sent to soldiers in the front and our allies in Europe. Other agencies in this effort included the Fuel Administration, which regulated coal and gasoline, and called for voluntary conservation of these resources. The Railroad Administration, which controlled railroads after they were nationalized, setting standard fares and leading to greater efficiency. And the Emergency Ship Corporation, which quickly built a fleet of merchant ships to transport men and send supplies to Europe. A war labor board was also set up to address labor disputes and organize workers during the war. The American Federation of Labor promised not to go to strike during the war, and its membership soared during the same period. Information and civil rights. The use of propaganda was important to draw massive support for the war effort. The Committee of Public Information was set up with the purpose of handling information related to the war, and created propaganda in the form of posters, pamphlets, and billboards, as well as making press releases for newspapers, and the newsreels shown in movie theaters. President Wilson also had to deal with critics and the growing general distrust of German Americans. Congress passed laws limiting civil rights during wartime. The Espionage Act created procedures for detecting and imprisoning spies, while at the same time giving the federal government power to read and censor the mail and arrest anyone interfering with the draft. The Sedition Act of 1918 made it a crime to use abusive or disloyal language against the government. Socialists and dissenters opposing the war were arrested on these bases. Charles Schenck was arrested for mailing leaflets advising young men to resist the draft, a clear violation of the Espionage Act of 1917. His case, Schenck versus the United States, made it to the Supreme Court. The decision upheld the limits to freedom of speech, based on the clear and present danger posed by defying the draft. Eugene Debs, the former socialist presidential candidate, was also arrested after an anti-war rally. In his case, Debs versus the United States, the court once more upheld restrictions on civil rights. Next, we will examine different experiences both overseas and in the home front. Women. Women rights organizations were actively campaigning for the right to vote and strongly opposed the war. Once the U.S. entered the war, the National American Women's Suffrage Association changed its mind and acted in support of the war effort, while Alice Paul's National Women's Party continued to oppose the war. In general, women helped by selling bonds, knitting socks, tending victory gardens, cooking meatless dinners, and wearing shorter skirts to save on fabric. Women also joined the Red Cross and served as nurses overseas. In the home front, some women took the factory jobs left by men serving in the war. German Americans. During World War I, German Americans faced tremendous prejudice and unfounded suspicions of being spies or even being loyal to Germany. American propaganda only exacerbated anti-German feelings, portraying Germans as bloodthirsty brutes committing atrocities. German foods were renamed. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, and hamburgers became Liberty steaks. German Americans faced many difficulties. As many as 4,000 of them were imprisoned as suspected spies, and about $200 million in assets were seized from German Americans. Many German Americans displayed loyalty to the United States by buying bonds and making their German last names sound more American. African Americans. African Americans were disappointed at President Wilson's record on race relations. Wilson had refused to integrate the armed forces and even reinstated segregation in the post office and the Treasury Department. African Americans, especially in the South, were subject to Jim Crow laws and constant lynchings. Nonetheless, African American leaders encouraged service, and many African Americans volunteered for the war. African Americans faced segregation in the military. They had to train in separate facilities and were assigned to fight with the French army rather than joining the American Expeditionary Force. About 100,000 African Americans served in France. The Harlem Hellfighters and other African American soldiers won important distinctions and medals for their heroism. France was a much less racist society, and African Americans came back demanding real changes on race relations in the United States. At home, the war generated a labor shortage, and African Americans began to be recruited to fill the gaps and work in factories in the North. The result was the Great Migration, a massive movement of African Americans from the South to cities in the Northeast and Midwest. Native Americans. Native Americans volunteered in great numbers and displayed great courage in the battlefield. All American Indians, 21 and older, who were either citizens or intending to become citizens, were recruited. Unlike African Americans, Native Americans served in integrated units. Choctaw Indians played a crucial role, sending and transmitting messages in their native language to avoid enemy listeners from deciphering codes or learning sensitive information. After the war, the Indian Citizenship Act of 1919 granted all Native Americans serving in the war their U.S. citizenship. Jewish Americans. Jewish Americans also faced prejudice and discrimination. After a Jewish man was lynched in Georgia, American Jews formed the Anti-Defamation League to oppose anti-Semitism and religious prejudice. American Jews joined the U.S. Army in disproportionate numbers and raised $63 million in relief funds to help people in Europe. Hispanic Americans. Mexican Americans in Texas and the Southwest enlisted in the Army. Restrictions on Mexican immigration were relaxed, and a good number of Mexicans came to work in the fields after the war generated a shortage of farm labor. In 1917, Congress extended U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans, making them subject to the draft. More than 18,000 Puerto Ricans served in the war. Asian Americans. Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, and Filipinos served in the war effort. Asian Americans were assigned to units for non-whites, and only a few of them saw combat. The Philippine National Guard was ready to join the fight in France. But the armistice that ended the war was signed before they could travel there. Conscientious objectors. This war had a great number of conscientious objectors, or men who refused to serve in the army based on their religious or moral beliefs to not kill others. Some conscientious objectors were allowed to serve in non-combatant roles, driving ambulances or caring for the wounded in the front, At home, they could work in farms or serve as firefighters. The American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization, provided alternative service for these men. Conscientious objectors were often subject to unfair treatment and public ridicule. Several hundred of them were imprisoned during the war, and 2 of them even died at the hands of their captors. In the next and final video in this unit, we will discuss the peace settlement process, the Versailles Treaty, and the League of Nations.